Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today we'll Masech the Zevachim daf Gimel. We are going to begin on Gimel Amud Aleph, about 12 lines from the top by the two dots. So we just began this lengthy Masechta, in which tells us that it's necessary that when a person does the avoda, it has to be for the right reasons. It has to be lishma. However, if it was done not lishma, in other words, let's say you had the intention, it's an actual olah, but your intention is for it to be a shlomim, so it's kosher, but it's not oil l'shem chayva. And then we said some exceptions to this, a three-way machlokas in our Mishnah. So on this, the Gemara continues, Su rami milsa achriti. So we pose another question. As we asked the question before, what's the din if, let's say, not that it was not lishma, but it was stam. So when it comes to stam, so then the din is that, as we saw by the takanas based in, that it's not necessary for you to say, I'm bringing this as an olah, because maybe you'll say the wrong word, so it's better to say nothing. So obviously that shows that stam is still acceptable. However, when it comes to gittin, it's required that it must be lishma, and stam does not work. So, mi omer Rabbi Yehuda omer Rav chata shachta l'shem oil psula. Is it really true that it was said in the name of Rav that when in regard to a carbon chatos, that it was shechted for the sake of an ola, that it's psula? Because we said in the Mishnah it excludes a carbon pesach at its time and a chatos. So, is that really true that if you would shecht a chatos, but you did it thinking that it was an ola, that it's possible? Shachtel Hashem chulin ksheira. And he also says, which is pretty amazing, that that's only because you at least were thinking about another carbon. However, if your mind was totally off, and you thought that this carbon, which was a chatas, is actually chulin, so then actually it works. And it's actually kosher, namely that you could still continue in the process of the avoda. Alma, what do we see from here? Dimina machrba. That when you're dealing with, let's say, the same species, namely we're both dealing with karbanos or kachim, so it's machrba, it could destroy the other. Namely, if you had the intention for a chatas and it was an ola, so because they're similar, so therefore because they're similar, that causes the problem. However, the lamina lo machrba. However, when we're dealing with chulin, which is not in the same ballpark as carbonos, so it doesn't do anything. It's not going to apostle it. So two carbonos are like the same species, but chulin and kachim are like different, so therefore it's not going to apostle with this particular kavana. Is that true? Or minhim? So we can ask the following question. Kol get jakasiv sholoshem isha apostle. If you wrote a get, not for the sake of this particular woman, it's not good. But if you shame avodas kachavim nami apostle, even if your intention was to write it for an avodas kachavim, a non-Jewish woman, says Rashi, dahash shaloi l'shem isha katani. This is mamash, someone that there's no din magittin. It's literally considered to be lav mina. So what do we see? The mashma shlo l'shem isha zu el l'shum isha cheres kol dehi. The afagav deves kachavim lav bas gerishin he mahani live soil. Alma de la mina macharba. So we actually see from Gittin that even though they're totally not the same, they could still cause problems for each other. He says, okay, that's true, but B'shani get, as we already mentioned, it's different over here because when it comes to a get, if you remove the fact that you had this improper machshava and you had no improper machshava, it's just no machshava, havile stam of a stam apostle. We still say it's possible even stam. However, by kashim dal chulim minayu havile stam of a stam ksherim. So in this situation, that is a major difference because the starting point is stam by a get is not good. Question 3. Shachta l'shem chulin ksher alma delav mina lo machrba. Meaning get shenichta l'shem vos kachavim posel alma delav mina machrev. So bekachim, remove chulin from it and it's still stam is kosher. By get, if you remove akum from it, stam is posel. Okay, so that's the answer. And then we continue, Varoma Milsachriti, so you can pose the other interesting point. Miyom Rabbi Yehuda Marav, does he really say Chata sheshachtal Hashem oil psul shachtal Hashem chulin kshera alma demina machref ba delo mina lo machref ba? Again, is that still true? That this concept that if there's something which is totally disconnected from the thing, it doesn't have any effect on it. Vasanya, but we learn it says the word tocho. Now this, we're going to actually end up saying it says tocho 4 times. But the pasuk says, "V'chol kli cheres," in any earthenware vessel, asher yipol mehem el tocho, kol asher b'socho yitma, v'yoso tishbru. Anything that's in it is also going to be tameh, and therefore it also has to be broken. Says Rashi, "Kol kli cheres v'lo toch toichai." So the drasha is only something which is in it, not toch tocho. V'afil kli shataf matzil. Even metal will save it. What does that mean? It says Rashi like this. Kli hamunach b'tanur. Let's say you have a kli that's put into an oven. Upivul malo min pi hatanur. However, the inner one, its lip is above it. In other words, it's not completely submerged in the outer kli. Rather, the inside kli is above the outer kli a bit. And you have food and drink inside this inner kli. The sheretz b'tanur, and there's a sheretz in the tanur, oichin shebekli tahirin. So the din is that only the kli is tameh, but not toich toichai, not the inner one, because it's not completely like submerged into this first one. And then Rashi says, even if we're talking about a kli cheres, it says even a kli shataf matzil, even a metal kli. Claimer, lo meboy kli cheres hamunach b'tanur. There's not only we're talking about a kli cheres that's in an oven, the matzil al ha'oichlin b'shabbataycha, that it works. So again, we're dealing with a sheretz that's in the oven, and the question is the status of the food inside the kli, which is inside the oven. Da toich toichahu. So we say that inside that kli is toich toichai. V'chol gufi leikol meimer de nitma ba'avir. The kli cheres is not matam, which is on the outside. So that's the din of kli cheres. Anything on the outside of it doesn't have any effect. Elafil kli shataf, even when it comes to a metal kli, shematam megaboy, that is matam the outside. Hacha taharu matzil. Here it will work. So what's the whole problem? Skipping a couple lines in Rashi. Tani kli shataf matzil. Since we mentioned that when it comes to this kli made out of metal, that it will save the food and drink, that it's tahar, alma dulamina chayetzbe. It's not the same as the oven, because this kli still, it gets in the way. So we see that it's considered to be chayetz, and it's like a separation, so it's not matam of the food. Hachinami lichush leichol shem chulin v'lissel. So just like this same thing, it's not the same as this earthenware oven. So you would think that it's lamina, so it shouldn't be machavba. It shouldn't like do anything, and therefore it shouldn't have the capacity to be able to be matzil. But it is matzil. So why is that? So we see that even though it's not the same thing, it still has an effect. So too in our case, it still has an effect. No, the shani, it's different. Also chulin etzel kachim, we consider chulin compared to kachim k'machitza etzel tanor, just like a wall to an oven. Ma machitza etzel tanor, just like a wall, lo mahani lo klal, doesn't help. Av chulin etzel kadashim lo mahani lo klal, doesn't help. It doesn't do anything. So we say both the kli and the oven are both really the same species. Both are considered like kalim. So therefore, that's the reason why it's machriv, if you will. But kanshim to chulin, they're like two separate minim, and therefore are not machriv. That's the basic idea. So it's, as Rashi, if you put a wall between the sheretz and the food, that doesn't do anything. That sheretz will be matam of the food. It's only when it's the food which is inside the kli. So it's a kli b'toich kli, which is, again, the kli is inside the oven, right? Okay, So Ditnan, as we learned, it says like this: Tanur shechatatsu b'nasarim. Let's say you have an oven in which there's planks that are in the middle of the oven to be able to separate it. Oh, bioriois. Let's say there's these, what it means, curtains, but again, these separations. Nimsa sheretz b'makom echad, and you have these sheretz on one side. Hakol tameh, even on the other side, since it's not like the oven, and therefore, because of that, they're completely, it doesn't work, right? So, because again, the whole notion is that a wall is just the same thing as chulin to kanshim, and therefore this wall to an oven is not machrba because it's not mina. Kavera shehi pechuta. Let's say you have this literally a beehive, but its structure is that it's open, upakuka bakash, and it's stuffed with straw because it's broken. Umisholeshes avir hatanur, and it's hanging into the airspace of the oven. Sheretz b'tocha, there's a sheretz hatanur tameh. In that situation, the oven also is going to be tameh. Says Rashi, Rabusa naka de'afagav de pekuka, even though it's kind of like stuffed in with all this straw, pechisasa b'kash will have a kli. It's not a kli. V'afil pihel malu and pi tanur lo matzelas al oichlin shebasoicha. It's not going to save the food, and therefore the food still becomes tameh, even though you like plugged up the hole, if you will. So that's what happens there. However, sheretz b'tanur, and you have a sheretz inside an oven. So he said, in that beehive, it's the food is considered to be is going to be tameh, as Rashi says, because it's not considered to be the same. Rabbi Lezer mataher. However, Rabbi Lezer will be mataher the beehive. Rabbi Lezer kavachimer. He says, I'll teach this as I'm correct, that the beehive should be tahar, this kaveres, based on the following kavachimer. Im matzil b'mei sachamor, if a wall, which does save regarding a mace, that it doesn't transfer the tumah, lo tatzel b'kli cheres akal, so the sheretz, which is less than a mace, so the partition should certainly be good enough so that it will be tahar. So that's why Rabbi Lezer says that the kaveris is tahar, because if a wall will separate regarding a mace, and tumas mace is much more chamor, then certainly when it comes to kli cheres, it should prevent it. So amru lo, so they said lo. No, you can't make such a kavachimer, so we continue to gimel mabez. Im hitzil b'meisa chamor. So you're right. When it comes to a mechitza, with regard to a mace, that it prevents the tumah from spreading, says Rashi, shemachitza mafsekes v'kelim shema'aver hasheni tahirin, and that on the other side, if there's a kli, it is tahar. Why is that? Shekin chaluka ohalin, because the wall separates the rooms. The whole din is oyel atuma, and it's like a separate room, and therefore that's why it has the capacity to stop the tumah and not allow the tumah to go the other place. So it's not the same thing when it comes to kli cheres, that if you would divide up a wall or something, that doesn't prevent anything. So you don't build walls in an oven so it doesn't protect, as it's an oven, and it makes the other things inside tameh, these particular food items. So basically he's saying it's not an acceptable kavachimer. So atinach rabbanon Rabbi Lezer ma'ikol meimar. So that's a good according to the rabbanon. How about Rabbi Eliezer? So Rabbi Lezer kavachimer kaimer. So Rabbi Lezer says kavachimer. Yihachi hasem nami name kavachimer. Kodshim mechalin kodshim. So when it comes to achatas and oila, it could make it mechalit. Chulin lo kol shekain. So you should say a kavachimer that certainly should be possible as well. Why do we say that if you have a machshava by chulin, you should say a kavachimer? If when it comes to kodshim, it's kodshim, so chulin certainly should become mechalel, and it shouldn't be good. El time of the Rav Rabbi Eliezer, the Yomi Rabbi Eliezer, my time of the Rav. Why is it that when it comes to having the wrong machshava regarding chulin, that it's still not a problem. Because the pasuk says, "V'yichalu Hashem as kachi b'nei Yisrael is asher yarimu Hashem." You should not profane that which is holy. Kedoshim mechal and kachim, which is mashma only something which is kodesh already can be mechal other kachim, like you have a machshav of a chatas and it's an oil, or vice versa. However, ein chulin mechal and kachim. So the pasuk just exerts a kasav that tells us that it doesn't work. Alma asakra. So again, we have this kavachomer, which it's not a kavachomer because we have a pasuk that says that if you have a machshava of chulin, it doesn't do anything. It says Rashi, oilam ba'almer b'lezer krav svirula, kegoin chulin v'kachim avol inyan machitza mekavachomer yof. He learns regarding machitza. There's this concept that he learns out of kavachomer that if it separates by tumas mace, so it should also separate when it comes to sherets. Kivan de b'meis hachomer matzos kavachomer lekli cheres hakal sheretz kal min hameis. Rashi just says it over here first time, but the question is, so if in fact we have a pasuk to get rid of the kavachomer, maybe we can also say the same thing. We have the pasuk of taicho to maybe get rid of this kavachomer, and maybe the pasuk again is telling you the din is that when it comes to a mechitza, it doesn't work. So only taicho disrupts to make the food in the kli tahar if the sheretz is in the oven. But a wall on the other side, it'll still be tameh as it's still tocho, and it won't save, and therefore that's going against the kavachomer, just like by mace. So it's a kasha on Rabbi Lezer. The pasuk should remove the kavachomer as the pasuk says otherwise. So just like we said, that kavachomer doesn't stand because we have this pasuk. So we also have a pasuk of taichai to tell you that maybe when it comes to a wall, it doesn't. That's not the din when it comes to the din of a tumas sheretz. It still is matam the oichin mashkin. So that's the question. So why don't we say the same thing? Hachanami leisi taicho laughing about kavachomer. So hi taichem boil away oichin she givlon batit dechnisan l'aver tanur. Actually, we need that pasuk for something else, and therefore the kavachomer will still stand. What do we need it for? In a situation where you're kneading, says Rashi, v'chifan batit, you have this food that's being kneaded, where there's tit saviv she'ein hasheretz yochel liga behen, or it's impossible for the sheretz to touch it. Dechnisan la'avir hatanur, and it's in the airspace of the oven. V'hachihu disrabu l'tuma midrasha deloy taich taichahu kidikamer taich taichahu dematzil. If it's again the kli cheres inside this oven, so it's going to be matzil oichin mashkin inside. Aval kafas tit lo michra b'bei of tu ishem taicho delamina. You'll become tamei as it is considered to be taichai. It's not considered to be taicho if we're dealing with like kneading this teat and putting it into the aver hatanur. Since touching is not matama, but very namal matama kamashmuan. Rabbanan hanach lo sricha kra. Says you don't need this pasuk. But again, the point is that really, according to Rabbi Lezer, you still can have the kavachomer to tell you that when it comes to this kaveris, it still is it's tahar if there's a wall, because if the wall is mafsik by tumas and mace, it's going to be mafsik by a sheretz. So you say, what do you mean? We have a pasuk of taicha, you will taicha. No, that Rasha is coming to tell you that's dafka if it's a kli cheres inside this oven. However, if it's kneaded mud or something along those lines, that will not be considered to be tocho, rather it's tocho, and therefore the sheretz can still be matam and the other things. Okay, look at question TA 13. You can begin to understand the challenges of this masechta. It's not easy to remember all this. Sheretz v'tanur, v'taharos ba'avir. You have sheretz in an oven. There's taharos in the air. In other words, because it's protruded out of the kli cheres. Elashish davar chaitzis b'neihem. Matai kuliyami have a chatzitza. Matai kuliyami lo have a chatzitza. And what is the machlokas? So when the taharos are inside the kli, right, the piv mala mepi hatanur, and the lip is above the oven, so everyone says it's chaitzitz. Im gibel ha'oichlin batit kolimel enu chaitzitz. If you have kneaded, it's kneaded with this teat, then it's not chaitzitz, and therefore it is matama. kaveres shehi pachusa or tanur shechatzusu b'nesarim. So that's the machlokus whether or not we use this kavachomer or not. Okay, you can, again, this really very hard Gemara over here, and it's going to be like that for the next 118 days. So let's get used to it. Okay, Rav Yosef Bar Ami Rami. So he also cited a question. Shinui kodesh shinui balam. He asked a question regarding a change of kodesh, regarding a change of who the owner is. Umashani, and he gave an answer. So mi amarav chatas shechachto Hashem chatas kshera, that if a person has a chatas and he shechs it for the sake of another chatas, right? Which means it wasn't for the same carbon, but it's the same carbon, but it wasn't necessarily for the same intention. Okay, so as Rashi, so Shinu Kodesh, Rashi says is Chatas Hashem Oyla, but here it says Chatas Sheshachto Hashem Chatas Chayev Sheshachto Hashem Chatas Dam. So it's a person did a shayga by eating blood or ate non-kosher fats, so you ended up, the Chatas was still brought, but was for a different type of sin. So therefore, that is also a shinui as far as your thought process regarding what the carbon's purpose was, even though it's still a chatas, kshera. So we say in this situation, it's actually kosher, which is pretty amazing. But again, it wasn't that you shechted it for a chatas for an oil, or you actually was a chatas for a chatas, but with the wrong sin. Well, shem oil psula. However, if it was a chatas for an oil, which is a totally different carbon, then it's possible. So we see that in this case, if it's not the same thing, like a chatas to an oila, that causes problems. However, demina lo machmer ba. We actually say a chatas for a chatas, which is the same thing, will not destroy it, which is actually the opposite of what we've been saying up until now. We said that when it's the same thing, that's when it's machmer. But let's say it's an oila, then you end up having the havami, thinking of the machshava, the kavana for chulin, then it's not a problem because it's not the same min. So la mina lo machar ba. Over here we see it's the opposite, that the same min is machar. So what do you see? The mina lo machar ba. If it's the same thing, that's when it's not machar. Yomarav chatas sheshachto al mi shemechuyev chatas. Let's say you brought a carbon chatas, you shechted it for someone else, right? So even if, let's say, it was the same sin, there was a different person that sinned. So this is considered to be a shinoi balim. So in this situation, chatas shechachto al mi shemechuyev chatas psula doesn't work, even though it's the same carbon, but it's a different person. So we see shinoi balim doesn't work. Al mi shemechuyev oyla kshera. However, let's say you brought a chatas, but you had in mind a totally different person and a different carbon, then it's kosher. Alma davar mina machrifa. If these two people were both having to have a chatas, so then that's where it's a problem. Dala mina lo machrifa. However, in this situation where your intention was for a chatas for this guy and an ola for the other guy, then it actually doesn't. It's not machriv. It says that it's still considered to be kosher. So which one is it? How do we understand this? The Mashani, we say it's a difference between the din of Shinui Kodesh and Shinui Balam. When the pasuk says v'shachat oisa, that you're going to be shechting for this carbon, l'chatas oim rachmana, it's for a chatas. V'hari chatas l'shem chatas nishchata. And here, Taki, it was done for the Shem Chatas. So therefore, it was a Chatas L'Shem Chatas, even though it was for a different Avera, right? One was Dam, one was Chalev, but nonetheless, it's kosher, because it was still done V'shachat Oisa, that you had the right intention that this is a Chatas. So therefore, it worked. Therefore, that's why it's good. However, Hacham Shini Balim, the Chipur Alav Ksiv, it says the Kapar has to be for him. Alav V'lal Chaveroi has to be for him and not for your friend. When you're having the machshava of doing the avoda, it has to be for this person, not for the other guy. That's why it didn't work. However, your friend is like him himself. That he's only puzzle when it's the same carbon. So therefore, it's only because I had intention to bring the chatas for him, but brought the chatas for him. That's when it's a problem. However, in this situation, when I had a chatas for him, and instead I thought it was an ola for him, right? So then it actually will be okay, because it's only in a situation where he's mechuyev the same kapara. If it's not the same kapara, it's not a chatas and a chatas, then it's not. It'll be kosher. Rav Chavibi Rami Shinu Baum a toich. He has a different stira. Mishani, he also answered, is it true that he said, if you had a person who shechs a chatos, for someone who is also chayav for a chatos, that it's psula, right? Because we said, which we said above, that, well, that's not what he said, right? Chatos sheshachta al mi shemechuyev chatos psula, al mi shemechuyev oil kshera, right? As we said, you had a different person, right? So this is a case of shinoi balim, right? So you intended to do a chatas for person A, instead you did chatas for person B. So in that situation, it's a problem. However, if I had intention for a chatas for this guy and it was really an oil for the other guy, that's when it's kosher. As we said, al mishim mechayev oil kshera alma demina. If it's the same thing, chatas and chatas machmer ba. So since it's that will cause the problem. La minu lo machmer ba. If this first guy was a chatas, the other guy was an oil, it's still kosher. That's what we see. Mosanya toichai, that when you put you have a sheretz in an oven, so it's matama, everything that's in the oven, but now which is inside of that kli. A field kli shot of matzah. We said that even something which is not even the same material as the oven, it's still matzah the oichon and mashkin. So what do we see? That even something which is lav mina, it's not the same min. Nonetheless, it is machrev, so to speak, that it does affect it. So therefore, it's a kasha. The Mishani arba toicha ksivi. The answer is that toicha is actually written 4 different times. Toich, toicha, toich, toichai. So because of it written that way, chad gufa. One is just for the pashut pshat of the pasuk. The chad gzer shava, and the second one is to tell us the gzer shava. Rashi helps us out over here. The gzer shava shiatam sheretz es hakli, that a sheretz can be matama kli. B'yafal pi shaloi nagaba, even though the sheretz is not touching the oich and the mashkin, but nonetheless it can be matama everything that's in the oven. So because that's what it's come to tell you, it doesn't even need to touch, but even it's matama ba'avir, the fact that it's in the same airspace. And then that's the second thing. So again, the first one is just lagufa. The second was the gzer shava, that a sheretz is matama oichlin, which is in the oven. Chad toichai shel zev lo toicha shel acher. What does that mean? Lemuti, says Rashi, it comes to exclude kli shataf mitumas avir elim ki naga. Again, if the sheretz touches it, that's a different thing. But if you have even a kli shataf, even a metal kli, that will separate it so that it's not going to be matama. Even though, again, we say this is lav mina, and it is machrif ba. That's only because there's exeris akasav, which tells us that. So that's basically what the answer is right here. The idach toich lo toich toichai, and the other one is telling you that it's only the food that are in the oven, but not if it's inside a kli in the oven. If kli shativ matzel, again, even a metal kli will be matzel. Okay, that's the end of that daf. And hopefully you'll remember it. So again, let's go through these questions one more time. Shachtel l'shem chulin kshera. So if you shechted it for a chulin, so again, if you shechted it for, it was a chatas, and you shechtel l'shem oil, it's puzzle. As a kshera, it's good. As a chulin, it's kosher. So we see la minav, it's not the same thing. Lo machrav, but it doesn't cause a problem. By get, we saw that it does work, right? That is a problem. It says, yeah, because when it comes to a get by ovas kachavim, if you remove ovas kachavim, it's still stam is possible. However, here by stam konshim, it's kosher. It's only when it's shalol l'shma. Number 4, ma pirish. How do we understand chatas shachta l'shem chatas? Chatas shachta l'shem chatas means that you shechted it. There was a person who needed to bring a carbon chatas because he ate chaylev. However, your intention was that he shechted it for the sake of the person who ate dam. So therefore, we say that's considered to be kosher. Now, even though that is seemingly, again, what do we see from here? We saw the lav mina machrach ba, the mina, because it's a chatas for a chatas, lo machrach ba, right? So we see that I don't write this is demina lo machriv ba. Okay, all right, that makes sense. Let's go back to question TA 13. Sheretz b'tanur. So you have a sheretz in the oven. V'taharis ba'avir. Hatanur, which that in itself would be matam of the food. El sheish davar hachaytz is b'neim. There's a chatzitza, right? So if the chatzitza actually does something, then that food does not become tameh. So when do we say that it's a chatzitza, the food is not tameh? And when do we say it's definitely not that it is tameh? And when do we say it's a machlokas? So again, in the event where the taharas are inside of another kli, right? So then it is chaytzeitz, because we say toich v'lo toich toichai. So therefore, since it's inside a kli, inside the oven, that food is not tameh. And in the case of gibel ha'oichlin betit, that doesn't work. And the machlokas was by kaveris, which was broken, and you put boards over there. So that's a machlokas, and it was based on the question: do we learn out of kal v'chomer madach by tumas mace, which is chamor? We see that a machitza is chaytzeitz. So too by tumas sheretz, we should say it's chaytzeitz, or maybe that's not a valid kal v'chomer. Okay, question TB15. Sheretz batana v'taras ba'avir hatanur el sheish davar hachaytz b'nehem mati kolayam v'chatzitz. Same question. And let's see if I got this correct. Let's see what I wrote. So this is going to be TB15. You have to really hold cup to know this. So I wrote, Toichai hu chatzitza, havi chatzitza. I'd say toichai. Right? So if you have, it's in a kli, yesh tit betanur, we'll have a chatzitza. Okay? Kaveris plukta. Okay, I'll accept it. Adkan.